The 38th floor of the Ingersoll Tower in the absolute heart of Manhattan smelled heavily of expensive imported espresso and ancient, unchallenged wealth. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a staggering view, where the entirety of New York City resembled a sprawling carpet of glittering crystal laid out at the feet of a single individual, Maximilian Ingersoll. Audrey Vance kept her gaze firmly cast downward, her hands rhythmically polishing the pristine white marble of the office floor. She was 28 years old, dressed in a plain navy blue uniform with an immaculate white apron, her fingers trembling not out of fear, but from a deeply suppressed, burning rage. She had learned the hard way how to remain silent, absorbing the sharp stings of humiliation, because she knew that speaking out, too, soon would destroy her only chance at uncovering the truth. Maximilian adjusted his silk necktie in front of his reflection, his voice dripping with utter disdain as he sneered at her, demanding to know if a worthless maid like her understood that when a man of his stature enters a room, the servants are supposed to completely vanish from sight. He made it brutally clear that he did not want to look at her, smell her presence, or even acknowledge that she occupied the same physical universe, to which she responded with a calm, serene tone that briefly caught him off guard. Reclining elegantly against the expensive Italian leather sofa nearby, Cassandra Dalton let out a sharp, melodic laugh that possessed a cutting edge far sharper than any steel blade. Dressed in flawless designer white, with a string of rare South Sea pearls gracing her neck, and her lips painted a perfect, striking crimson, she was Maximilian's fiancée, or at least that was what the elite society magazines and corporate legal contracts claimed. She looked at Audrey as if she were nothing more than an unsightly, bothersome stain on an incredibly expensive Persian rug, whispering to Maximilian that those rough, calloused hands were clearly born for nothing but mopping floors. Cassandra remarked cruelly that some individuals were naturally born to command, while others were destined by nature to blindly obey, an arrogant philosophy that made Audrey's heart ache with a fierce, quiet intensity. Audrey kept her eyes glued to the stone beneath her, but within her soul, a profound transformation was occurring as she reminded herself that just 3 short years ago, those exact same hands had cracked open chests in chaotic emergency rooms. She had held beating human hearts in her palms, commanding them to return to life when all hope seemed entirely lost because Audrey Vance was no ordinary maid. She had been one of the most brilliant cardiologists at the Metropolitan Central Hospital before a massive conspiracy stripped her of everything she held dear. Maximilian dismissed Cassandra's cruel remarks, not out of any genuine sense of compassion, but out of sheer boredom, stating that the household staff was not worth wasting precious breath or energy upon. He seated himself behind his massive mahogany desk, a piece of furniture so incredibly large and imposing it looked like a dark altar dedicated to corporate power, holding a silver laptop, a solid gold pen, and a freshly brewed cup of coffee. He took a long, slow sip of the hot beverage while frowning deeply at a stack of financial documents while Cassandra approached him from behind to gently massage his tense shoulders with her soft, manicured hands. She purred softly, advising him not to overexert himself because his heart was in no condition for sudden shocks, asking if he had remembered to take his prescribed medications that morning. He grunted in response, stating that he had taken them and that his personal physician, Dr. Harrison Logan, insisted he was in better physical health than ever before. Cassandra purred in agreement, noting that Dr. Logan was always correct. But as she spoke, Audrey caught a fleeting glimpse of something incredibly cold and calculating gleaming deep within Cassandra's eyes, an expression that completely contradicted the warmth of a woman supposedly in love. Audrey gathered her heavy cleaning bucket and turned to leave the room quietly. But before she could reach the heavy wooden door, an abrupt and terrifying event shattered the silence. Maximilian let out a strange, choked gasp as the porcelain coffee cup slipped from his trembling fingers, smashing violently against the desk and splashing dark liquid all over the important documents. He convulsively clutched his chest with one hand, while his other hand gripped the edge of the mahogany desk so fiercely that his knuckles turned a stark, ghost-like white. Cassandra immediately took a panicked step backward rather than forward, her voice trembling slightly as she asked him what was wrong, to which he could only manage a desperate wheezing gasp for air. His face rapidly transformed into the color of cold ash, heavy beads of sweat pooling across his forehead as his previously arrogant eyes widened, with a primal terror that no amount of money could ever buy or banish. He slid heavily from his plush leather chair and collapsed onto the polished, marble floor that Audrey had just finished cleaning, gasping for breath as his life hung by a single, fragile thread. Cassandra screamed for someone to call an ambulance, yet she remained utterly frozen in place, her hand resting uselessly against her pearls as she watched her wealthy fiancé writhe in agony on the floor. In that single, eternal second of hesitation, Audrey recognized a chilling truth that made her blood run cold. Cassandra was not truly seeking help, she was waiting for him to die. Breaking through her submissive disguise, Audrey dropped her bucket, allowing the dirty water to spill across the marble as she crossed the office in 3 massive strides, and knelt beside the man who had humiliated her minutes prior. Her voice completely changed, shedding the quiet compliance of a servant and adopting the firm, commanding tone of a seasoned medical professional as she demanded that Maximilian look directly into her eyes. Cassandra shrieked in anger, ordering the servant not to touch him, but Audrey completely tuned her out as her practiced fingers pressed firmly against his neck to find the carotid artery. Finding a weak, dangerously irregular pulse, she tore open his tie and unbuttoned his shirt, sharply demanding to know his cardiac history and exactly what medications he was taking. When Cassandra stammered uselessly about Dr. Harrison Logan's prescriptions, Audrey noticed a series of subtle anomalies, the bizarre dilation of his pupils and the distinct texture of his skin that did not perfectly align with a standard myocardial infarction, archiving the detail for later. She focused entirely on keeping him alive, instructing him to synchronize his breathing with her own steady rhythm, while Maximilian stared up at her through the blinding veil of agony and terror. He saw an absolute, unshakable certainty in the eyes of the woman he had just scorned, desperately clutching her wrist with his remaining strength and pleading with her not to abandon him. Audrey looked at him with fierce determination and boldly declared that she would not leave him because she was a doctor, a statement that echoed through the room like a thunderbolt. As Max's heart suddenly stopped beneath her palms, she immediately ordered the terrified reception staff to bring the automated external defibrillator while she began powerful, rhythmic chest compressions. After 30 precise compressions and 2 deep ventilations, she applied the pads to his chest, cleared the area, and administered the sharp electrical shock that caused his body to arch violently. Within moments, a gasping, desperate burst from his lips as his eyes fluttered open, returning from the brink of death just as the distant wail of emergency sirens began to echo up from the New York streets below. The private hospital suite located within Manhattan's most exclusive medical facility resembled a high-end luxury hotel rather than a traditional ward for the critically ill. Maximilian Ingersoll lay propped up against a mountain of crisp white pillows, his body connected to a sophisticated monitor that continuously traced the electrical activity of his heart in bright green lines. He was alive and stable, a miraculous outcome achieved entirely because of a woman who, according to every official employment record, was nothing more than temporary cleaning staff. Audrey waited patiently out in the long, quiet corridor, still wearing her stained navy blue uniform because she refused to return home until she was certain. A fundamental part of her identity, the doctor that could never be truly extinguished, needed to ensure the patient survived the critical post-arrest window, while another darker part of her soul, hidden for 3 long years, had its own deeply personal reasons for remaining close. The quiet hum of the hallway was suddenly broken as the elevator doors slid open, and Cassandra Dalton stepped out with the grand air of a monarch entering a royal court. She wore towering designer heels that clicked sharply against the floor, oversized sunglasses despite being indoors, and walking closely beside her was a tall man with perfectly coiffed silver hair and an immaculate white lab coat. Audrey felt the air violently leave her lungs as she recognized that face immediately, for she had seen it in the center of her worst nightmares during 1,000 sleepless nights. It was Dr. Harrison Logan, the exact same medical authority who 3 years ago had signed the falsified malpractice report that utterly demolished her medical career. He was the man who had solemnly testified before the state medical board that Dr. Audrey Vance was dangerously negligent, ensuring her license was permanently revoked, while offering smooth, velvet-toned condolences that masked a calculated lie. Audrey instantly turned her back toward them, pretending to stare out the large window at the glittering New York skyline, while her heart hammered so violently against her ribs she feared the monitors inside the room would pick up the sound. Cassandra spoke in a hurried whisper to the doctor, explaining that Maximilian had almost slipped away, and that the person who miraculously performed the resuscitation was one of their own maids who claimed to be a doctor. Dr. Logan stopped dead in his tracks, his cold, calculating eyes narrowing as he stared directly at the back of the woman, wearing the blue uniform. He walked slowly toward her, each step echoing like a grim judicial sentence down the empty corridor, before politely asking the young woman to turn around so he could discuss the emergency treatment she had administered. Audrey took a deep, stabilizing breath, knowing that fleeing would only confirm she had something to hide, and turned slowly to look her bitter enemy dead in the eyes. She witnessed the precise millisecond of recognition flash across Dr. Logan's face, the sudden dilation of his pupils, the tightening of his jaw, and the way the color drained instantly from his expensive complexion. To an ordinary observer, the reaction would have been completely imperceptible, but Audrey had spent 3 agonizing years waiting for this exact moment of confrontation, and she savored his hidden panic. She calmly detailed the cardiopulmonary resuscitation she had performed, and how she utilized the automated defibrillator after the patient experienced a full cardiac arrest lasting nearly 2 entire minutes. Logan swallowed hard, visibly forcing himself to regain his professional composure as Cassandra asked with deep suspicion if the two of them somehow knew one another. Logan lied instantly and aggressively, laughing off the suggestion while stating he could never possibly know a member of the janitorial staff, though his eyes remained locked onto Audrey's with a venomous intensity. Before the tense silence could stretch any further, the heavy door to the private suite swung open, and a young nurse stepped out to announce that Maximilian had fully regained consciousness. The nurse explained that the billionaire was actively demanding to see the specific young woman in the blue uniform who had saved his life on the office floor. Cassandra immediately pushed past them, loudly declaring that Maximilian must surely mean his loving fiancée, but the nurse uncomfortably clarified that he had specifically requested the maid. Cassandra's face contorted into a mask of pure rage, but Audrey did not wait for her permission as she walked directly past the furious woman and entered the quiet, sterile room. Maximilian looked considerably paler than usual, but a distinct spark of his former authority had returned to his eyes the moment he saw her approach, the edge of his bed. He spoke in a low, raspy whisper, admitting that he initially believed her miraculous intervention had been nothing more than a feverish dream, but Audrey softly assured him that he was truly safe. He closed his eyes for a long moment, a genuine expression of deep shame washing over his rugged features as he recalled the cruel words he had spoken to her that very morning. He asked her directly why she had fought so fiercely to save his life after the absolute disrespect and arrogance he had subjected her to. Audrey looked at him, thinking of her sacred medical oaths, her deceased sister Rachel, and the long-simmering desire for justice, but she simply replied that a true doctor does not choose patients based on their manners. As she left the room to let him rest, she could hear Logan and Cassandra whispering venomously in the shadow of the corridor, declaring that Audrey was the only threat capable of destroying everything they had built, and that she could no longer be allowed to remain alive. 3 entire days after surviving the near-fatal cardiac event, Maximilian Ingersoll returned to his sprawling estate in the Hamptons under strict medical orders to maintain absolute bed rest. Dr. Harrison Logan had been incredibly firm, forbidding any business meetings, office work, or emotional stress, prescribing a strict diet and a regimen of specific pills to be taken exactly 3 times a day. However, Maximilian had not built a multi-billion-dollar global empire by blindly following orders, and a burning question was consuming his mind far more than any physical discomfort in his chest. Late that afternoon, locked safely inside his private study, He summoned Ethan Sanders, the loyal chief of security who had served his family faithfully for over 20 consecutive years. Maximilian commanded Ethan to launch a completely discreet, highly confidential investigation into the background of the maid known as Aurora Vela, emphasizing that absolutely no one, especially Cassandra or Dr. Logan, could know about it. While the machinery of wealth began to dig into her secrets, Audrey Vance sat alone in her modest apartment, located in a quiet corner of Brooklyn, completely surrounded by shadows and memories. She sat directly on the floor of her small living room, illuminated only by a single lamp, with dozens of medical documents, old newspaper clippings, and manila folders spread out around her. The central wall of her apartment had been transformed into a complex web of photographs, red strings, and heavily underlined names, resembling the lair of a woman completely obsessed with a singular mission. In the absolute center of this chaotic grid hung a photograph of a beautiful young woman with a radiant, wide smile who looked nearly identical to Audrey, but possessed a much brighter light. Beneath the picture, written in bold black marker, was a single name: Rachel. Her beloved younger sister, who had tragically lost her life at the tender age of 22. Audrey gently picked up the photograph, tears welling in her eyes as she stared at the face she had mourned every single night for 3 agonizing years. Rachel had been admitted to the Metropolitan Central Hospital for what should have been a completely routine, minor surgical procedure to correct a simple cardiac arrhythmia. Audrey had performed that exact operation successfully dozens of times, but hospital regulations strictly forbade intervening on an immediate family member, forcing her to trust her colleagues. She had placed her absolute faith in the medical system, and specifically in Dr. Harrison Logan, who reigned as the chief of cardiology, but Rachel tragically died right there on the operating table due to unexpected complications. When a devastated Audrey secretly reviewed the official surgical files, she discovered terrifying discrepancies, altered medication dosages, erased medical logs, and an anesthesiologist who completely changed his story 3 separate times. The moment Audrey began demanding a formal internal investigation, the entire corrupt medical establishment slammed shut against her like a carefully designed steel trap. Within days, falsified documents surfaced bearing her forged signature, framing her as the negligent doctor responsible for a series of catastrophic clinical errors she had never committed. Dr. Logan had stood before the medical board with a face of tragic solemnity, painting Audrey as an emotionally unstable woman completely destroyed by grief and entirely unfit to practice medicine. They stripped her of her hard-earned medical license, dragged her family name through the mud, and made her appear to the public as a dangerous, incompetent fraud. For 3 long years, she lived in the ashes of her ruined life, gathering evidence until she finally pocketed a hidden corporate entity connecting her sister's death to a massive financial empire, the Ingersoll Medical Foundation. 2 days later, Ethan Sanders quietly re-entered Maximilian's private study, carrying a thick leather folder beneath his arm and bearing an incredibly grave expression upon his weathered face. He placed the file on the desk and revealed that the maid known as Aurora Vela did not actually exist, her identification documents being nothing more than an exceptionally high-quality forgery. He explained that her real name was Dr. Audrey Vance, a brilliant former cardiologist who had been the absolute star of her medical school generation until a massive malpractice scandal ruined her 3 years ago. Ethan pointed out that the patient who died under her alleged care was actually her own sister, Rachel, and that the medical authority who signed the harsh condemnation was none other than Maximilian's own trusted physician, Dr. Harrison Logan. Maximilian felt the room spin as he realized the woman who saved him had every reason to utterly loathe his entire existence. Using his immense corporate influence, Maximilian secretly obtained the original, unedited operating room report from that fateful surgery 3 years ago, a document that had been locked away in a secure archive. As he read through the faded pages, his hands shook with a mixture of profound shock and intense fury, for the original words proved a terrifying truth. Dr. Logan had explicitly admitted in the initial draft that the medication dosages given to Rachel Vance had been catastrophically altered by the floor administrator, and that Audrey was never present in the room. Audrey was completely innocent a blameless victim framed to protect a dark corporate secret, and Maximilian held the definitive proof in his very hands. He was so completely absorbed in the shocking revelation that he failed to hear his office door swing open as Cassandra and Dr. Logan stepped into the room, forcing him to quickly slam the folder shut and hide it beneath a stack of ordinary corporate papers. The following morning, Maximilian engineered a private meeting with Audrey inside a completely deserted conference room on the 20th floor of the tower, far away from any potential surveillance. He closed the heavy door securely, turned to face her, and spoke her true name aloud, watching as her entire posture stiffened into a defensive guard. He quickly revealed that he had launched a full investigation into her past, discovering the tragic truth about her sister Rachel and the immense injustice she had suffered at the hands of the medical board. Audrey's eyes flashed with a brilliant defensive anger as she told him he had no right to speak her sister's name, but Maximilian quickly held up his hands to calm her. He explicitly confessed that he had found the original, unedited surgical report proving her complete innocence, promising that he possessed the power to clear her name and expose Dr. Logan's treachery. Audrey stared at the powerful billionaire, her deep-seated suspicions slowly giving way to absolute bewilderment as she demanded to know why a man of his status would ever choose to help a disgraced maid. Maximilian admitted that her selfless actions on the office floor had opened his eyes to the profound rot consuming his own corporate empire and the people he had blindly trusted for years. He then shifted the conversation to his own failing health, describing how he had suffered from extreme fatigue, chronic nausea, bizarre dizzy spells, and violent heart palpitations for several consecutive months. He recalled the sharp, knowing look Audrey had given him right before his collapse and begged her for an honest, independent medical opinion regarding his true condition. Audrey's medical mind transiently took over as she began connecting the strange clinical pieces that had bothered her from the very beginning. She explained to him with absolute clarity that his specific combination of symptoms did not align with a natural, progressive cardiovascular disease, noting that his dilated pupils and cold sweat suggested something far more sinister. She looked him directly in the eyes and whispered her terrifying hypothesis. He was being subjected to a slow, highly calculated, cumulative poisoning designed to mimic a natural heart failure. Audrey reasoned that whoever was responsible wanted him to fade away gradually so that his eventual death would be viewed by the world as an expected medical inevitability. To prove this theory, she instructed him to help her gather secret samples of his daily medications and, most importantly, the specific herbal tea that Cassandra personally prepared for him every single night. That very evening, Audrey crept into his private bathroom to secure the samples, wrapping them in sterile bags before rushing to a hidden laboratory owned by a loyal, former colleague. She worked tirelessly under the harsh fluorescent lights of the laboratory until the early hours of the morning, utilizing advanced chemical separation techniques to analyze the molecular structure of the liquids. When the final toxicology report flashed across the computer monitor, Audrey gasped in absolute horror as the terrifying truth was laid bare before her eyes. The standard cardiac pills were completely unadulterated, but the innocent herbal tea that Cassandra lovingly served him every night was heavily laced with a massive concentration of digitoxin. Digitoxin was a powerful cardiac glycoside that could stabilize a failing heart in micro-dosages, but when stealthily administered day after day, it accumulated in the tissue, triggering lethal arrhythmias and eventual full cardiac arrest. Cassandra was using the tea as a flawless, virtually untraceable weapon, ensuring that Maximilian's own heart would eventually become the instrument of his destruction. With her hands trembling from the shocking discovery, Audrey dialed the emergency phone number Maximilian had given her, but her blood ran cold when Cassandra's sweet, melodic voice answered the call instead. Realizing that Cassandra had complete control over the billionaire's personal phone, Audrey instantly altered her voice, adopting the bored, monotone cadence of a late-night pharmacy clerk. She smoothly claimed to be calling from a local 24-hour pharmacy to confirm a pending prescription delivery ordered under Maximilian's name by Dr. Harrison Logan. The clever mention of Dr. Logan's name caused Cassandra to immediately drop her suspicion. casually instructing the supposed clerk to deliver the items to the Hamptons estate the following morning before abruptly hanging up. Audrey collapsed back into her chair, realizing that the conspiracy was actively moving toward its final, lethal phase and that the next cup of tea could easily be Maximilian's last. At the absolute break of dawn, Audrey met secretly with Maximilian and Ethan Sanders inside an abandoned equipment warehouse located in the industrial basement of the tower. She presented the undeniable toxicology reports, explaining that Cassandra was administering the poison while Dr. Logan utilized his medical authority to cover up the physical decline as a natural disease. Ethan grimly noted that once Maximilian was dead, Cassandra would inherit the entire multi-billion-dollar foundation, while Logan would secure ultimate control over the medical research facilities. Audrey warned Maximilian that he must absolutely stop consuming the lethal tea immediately, but emphasized that he must continue to perfectly feign weakness and physical deterioration to prevent the conspirators from altering their timeline. They agreed to play an incredibly dangerous game of psychological chess, forcing the villains into a false sense of absolute victory so they could be caught red-handed. Over the course of the following week, the atmosphere inside the Grand Hamptons estate grew increasingly tense as the dangerous deception deepened. Maximilian played his role perfectly, dragging his feet across the expensive carpets, eating minimal amounts of food, and constantly complaining of severe dizziness in Cassandra's presence. However, Cassandra was an incredibly sharp and perceptive woman, and she began to notice subtle inconsistencies that aroused her deep suspicion. She noticed that despite his apparent physical decline, his complexion occasionally seemed remarkably healthy, and she frequently spotted the maid hovering near his private quarters. One evening, her eyes narrowing with a predatory focus, she stood over his bed and refused to leave the room until she watched him swallow every single drop of the poisoned tea, forcing Maximilian to actually consume the toxic liquid. The direct dose of digitoxin left Maximilian pale and suffering from violent heart palpitations the following morning, signaling to Audrey they were rapidly running out of precious time. However, before they could execute their counter-strategy, Cassandra struck a devastating blow by orchestrating a massive public ambush right in the center of the tower's crowded lobby. Late that afternoon, as Audrey walked through the glass atrium, she was suddenly surrounded by 2 police officers, a building official, and an incredibly smug Dr. Harrison Logan. Cassandra pointed a dramatic, manicured finger at Audrey, loudly proclaiming to the dozens of gathered employees that this woman was a dangerous, criminal imposter. She shouted that the maid had infiltrated the building, using forged documents and a stolen identity to maliciously manipulate a vulnerable, dying billionaire into altering his financial estate. Dr. Logan stepped forward with a face of manufactured sorrow, solemnly confirming to the shocked crowd that Audrey was indeed a disgraced former physician whose medical license had been permanently revoked for killing a patient. The surrounding employees immediately began whispering in disgust, turning their backs on Audrey as the officers rudely grabbed her arms and slammed heavy steel handcuffs onto her wrists. Audrey felt a wave of familiar horror wash over her as the exact same public humiliation from 3 years ago repeated itself like a terrible nightmare. As they dragged her toward the waiting police cruiser, Cassandra leaned in close to her ear, whispering with a sickening, venomous smile that Audrey would disappear forever, just like her pathetic little sister Rachel. The explicit mention of Rachel's murder sent a physical shock through Audrey's body, revealing that Cassandra's involvement in her family's tragedy ran far deeper than she had ever imagined. Hours later, Maximilian woke from a heavy, medically induced sedation that Cassandra had ordered the household nurse to administer under the guise of helping him rest. The moment his mind cleared, Ethan Sanders rushed into his bedroom to deliver the terrifying news of Audrey's public arrest and the criminal charges filed against her. Maximilian's eyes blazed with a fierce, absolute fury as he threw off his blankets, his apparent weakness completely vanishing as he demanded his clothes, his vehicle, and his most aggressive corporate defense attorneys. Within less than an hour, Maximilian arrived at the police precinct like a devastating hurricane, utilizing his immense financial power and legal leverage to secure Audrey's immediate release on bail. When Audrey walked out of the bleak holding cell and saw the powerful billionaire waiting for her in the lobby, her emotional armor cracked and she allowed him to pull her into a fierce, protective embrace. That very night, an extraordinary and deeply unexpected rebellion began to take shape within the hidden industrial kitchens of the Ingersoll Tower. Deborah Ross, the beloved head cook who had fed the building's executive staff for over 30 years, slammed her wooden spoon down in absolute outrage upon learning of Audrey's arrest. She declared fiercely to the other kitchen staff that Audrey was a woman of pure gold who had saved the master's life while the elegant Cassandra did absolutely nothing. Joining the alliance was Gary, the tower's veteran night porter, a thin man who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every secret meeting and hidden corridor within the massive skyscraper. Gary revealed to Ethan Sanders that he had secretly duplicated the surveillance recordings of Dr. Logan and Cassandra meeting privately inside the dark offices, capturing definitive video evidence of them discussing the lethal tea and the timeline of the murder. The improbable group of allies, the billionaire, the disgraced doctor, the security chief, the loyal cook, and the observant porter, gathered inside a secure, unmarked safe house to finalize their ultimate trap. Gary played the stolen surveillance files on a laptop, revealing clear footage of Cassandra, impatiently demanding to know how much longer it would take to eliminate Maximilian. Dr. Logan could be heard urging patience, explicitly stating that the death must appear completely natural, just like the successful operation they had pulled off with the other girl 3 years ago. Gary then handed Audrey an old, dusty paper folder he had rescued from a forgotten corporate archive containing the true, unaltered medical files of her sister Rachel. Audrey opened the folder and choked back a sob as she saw Cassandra's signature on the specific pharmaceutical orders that had delivered the lethal dose of digitoxin to Rachel, proving that her sister had been murdered by the exact same monstrous pair. The final strategy they designed was an incredibly dangerous gamble that required absolute, flawless precision from every single participant. Audrey explained with a clinical gravity that she would use a sophisticated combination of temporary blocking agents to induce a controlled, pharmacological arrest within Maximilian's body. To any observing physician, including the treacherous Dr. Logan, Maximilian would appear entirely deceased, possessing absolutely no detectable pulse, neurological response, or respiration. Audrey emphasized that she would have a frantic window of only a few critical minutes to administer the reversal compound and perform resuscitation before permanent neurological damage occurred. Maximilian looked into her eyes without a single trace of hesitation, stating firmly that he would gladly place his physical life into her exceptional hands 1,000 times over because she was the only person who had ever cared for his soul rather than his vast fortune. The following evening, the complex trap was set into motion as prosecutor Brenda Quinn and a team of undercover state investigators stationed themselves inside a surveillance van parked directly outside the estate. Cassandra entered the master bedroom, carrying the silver tray and the beautifully porcelain cup, watching with a hidden satisfaction as Maximilian drank the liquid down to the very last drop. Within 10 minutes, the powerful blocking drugs took complete control of his cardiovascular system, causing his body to collapse heavily onto the floor as his breathing ceased entirely. The portable cardiac monitor beside his bed immediately emitted a flat green line and a sharp, continuous, defining beep that echoed through the silent room. Cassandra stood over his motionless body, a chilling laugh of absolute triumph escaping her lips as she dialed Dr. Logan to joyfully announce that the billionaire was finally dead, and that the entire global empire belonged to them. The moment Cassandra finished confessing her crimes into the phone, the bedroom door exploded inward as prosecutor Brenda Quinn and a dozen armed state agents flooded the room with weapons drawn. Simultaneously, Audrey rushed forward from her hiding place, instantly kneeling beside Maximilian's pale form as her fingers flew across her medical kit to prepare the life-saving reversal injection. She plunged the needle deep into his arm, commencing powerful, rhythmic chest compressions, while counting the critical seconds remaining on her digital stopwatch. Cassandra shrieked in absolute terror as she realized she had walked into a beautifully executed ambush watching in disbelief as the flat line on the monitor suddenly fractured into a steady, healthy rhythm. Maximilian took a massive, gasping breath of air, his eyes flying open as he looked up into Audrey's tear-streaked face, returning triumphantly from the kingdom of death. An hour later, Dr. Harrison Logan arrived at the mansion carrying his leather medical bag, fully prepared to sign the official certificate of natural death, only to walk directly into a room filled with law enforcement and flashing media cameras. The smooth, velvet-toned composure completely abandoned the corrupt doctor as Prosecutor Quinn held up the recorded audio confessions and the unaltered pharmaceutical documents from Rachel's murder. Realizing their absolute ruin, the two conspirators instantly turned upon one another, screaming accusations of guilt and betrayal as the police firmly locked the steel handcuffs around their wrists. They were rudely marched out of the grand estate in front of a massive crowd of reporters, their names permanently ruined as the dark history of their medical murders was broadcast to the entire nation. In the beautiful months that followed the dramatic exposure of the conspiracy, a profound process of healing and ultimate justice swept through their lives. The State Medical Board issued a formal public apology to Dr. Audrey Vance, completely exonerating her reputation and restoring her professional medical license with the highest honors they could bestow. Maximilian utilized a massive portion of his corporate inheritance to completely dissolve the corrupt elements of his foundation, constructing a state-of-the-art free medical center named the Rachel Vance Memorial Cardiology Clinic. Audrey assumed the role of chief director, providing elite cardiac care to thousands of impoverished families who could never otherwise afford treatment, while Deborah managed the nutritional kitchens and Gary oversaw the entire security department. One beautiful spring afternoon, surrounded by a sea of white flowers and the warm smiles of the community they had saved, Maximilian and Audrey were officially wed in a joyful celebration of life and love. A year after that historic day, Audrey and Maximilian walked hand in hand through the peaceful, sunlit gardens of the clinic, stopping before a beautiful bronze statue dedicated to the memory of her sister. Audrey gently took her husband's large hand and placed it softly over the distinct, beautiful curve of her growing belly, whispering, with a radiant smile, that they were going to welcome a child into the world. Maximilian pulled her into a deeply tender embrace, tears of pure happiness streaming down his face as he realized that he had finally found the one thing his immense wealth could never buy. This profound journey through betrayal and redemption reminds us that the true value of a human life can never be calculated by the balance of a bank account or the arrogance of a social title, for true wealth resides entirely within the capacity to show mercy and humility to those around us. As we grow older and look back upon the long, winding road of our experiences, we come to understand that justice may sometimes walk with slow, agonizing steps, but the truth will always find its way through the darkest shadows to illuminate our path. The hearts that beat with genuine love, selflessness, and integrity will ultimately survive the storms of malice, finding their true purpose in lifting others up and establishing a lasting legacy of kindness that echoes through generations.